changes in diets. What is the cheapest things at the grocery store? Haiti, ichiban, ravioli, highly processed foods that aren't good for you. This is causing increases in diabetes and obesity in the community. And then the last is the cultural losses, the inability to practice our traditional hunting, fishing, foraging cultural lifestyles is leading to sort of stagnant activities in the community. And then they have the boom in Fort McMurray, which, you know, there's also all sorts of problems with that we've seen, and people have documented the increase of drug use in the town of, or in the city of Fort McMurray, and that's starting to come up into the communities of Fort Chipewyan as well. So there's increase of drug and alcohol abuse and other psychological disorders, and some people are starting to refer to these psychological disorders as nature deficit disorder, because we're not being able to access and go out onto the lands as much as we want to. And this isn't just unique to Fort Chipewyan. We're seeing these things happen in cities and urban centers as well, where children don't have access to being out on the land and being out in nature in the way that as a human species we're intended to be. And so we're seeing the rise of sort of psychological disorders that are largely linked to our disconnection from being able to access lands. I mean, we're, again, going back to that first slide, I'm only the third generation from treaty. My father was a trapper his whole life and lived on the land his whole life. I'm the first generation of my family to live in a city. So, you know, we're not just sitting here and complaining about things, and we've made many steps in the right direction to try and fight for better protections of lands and species for the continuation of our rights and our subsistence lifestyles. We've done studies on the Athabasca River and knowledge and use and change to really to try to present to governments that there are other ways of being, there are other ways of knowing. And traditional ecological knowledge is being recognized as a viable sort of resource into framing how to create better biodiversity protection measures in other parts of the world, and yet here in Canada we haven't quite made it onto that boat yet. And so our community is really trying to push that envelope and really looking at ways that we can incorporate traditional ecological knowledge into a framework of building sustainable and biodiverse regions in Alberta. So, and then the other report that we've worked on is a stewardship strategy for the protection of woodland caribou and bison, where we actually talk about the necessity of co-management in the region. We have very distinct guidelines that say, listen, we need to talk about co-management. We need to talk about what we have as traditional knowledge holders of how this region has worked for us for thousands of years, and passed down through oral traditions and not training, but traditional knowledge passing down through generations, that we have to take that into consideration moving forward, and we have to meld those things together with Western science and methodologies to create strong stewardship plans in the region so that we can have food security, species conservation, and biodiversity conservation in the region. And you know, that really comes down to, what do we need to be doing? We need to be fighting for the better protection of ourselves, of our rights, and of species, because we are all in this together. I've heard this a million times. There are different ways of being, and agriculture is a big part of it, and you know, it's starting to take off in the community of Fort Chipewyan because of changing climates, which we can get into discussion on climate change, but that's not why I'm here. But we are seeing gardens take off in the community of Fort Chipewyan. We're seeing the desire to create greenhouses because of the fact that we can't access our traditional foods as much as we used to. But we need better stewardship and protection of our lands and resources, and we need to be looking at ways that we can develop new ways of being that mix with the new ways of being. Just gardens in the community of Fort Chipewyan are popping up all over the place now, because it's not just because, oh, people think it's really cool. It's because when you go to the northern store, the only grocery store in Fort Chipewyan, if you want to buy a bag of apples, you're paying like $16 for a bag of, you know, Macintosh apples. Whereas, you know, why not plant an apple tree? Or why not plant some carrots where you can get them yourself? So we're seeing this happen already, and the leadership is looking at developing greenhouses to create more food for the community at a subsidized rate, and it also creates jobs and employment. And that's where we have to begin to build those bridges and boundaries, or drop those boundaries and build bridges of discussions on ways that we can move forward, and understanding and respecting the different ways of being. course, agriculture, on the level it works in southern Alberta, is never going to work in places like Fort Chipewyan. But where can the knowledge of sustainable agriculture come into play in communities like this? And where can our knowledge as knowledge holders of the land in this area come into play with the stewardship and the development of land within our traditional treaty territory? And so that's kind of where we're at right now. ACFN has really been thrust to the forefront of the controversy around tar sands development and oil sands development in the region, and many NGOs have sort of taken our sort of claims and really pushed us to the forefronts of it. And our chief has said a million times, we're not against development, whether it's agricultural or energy development. What we do want to see is we want to see co-management, we want to see dialogue and stewardship, we want to see consultation, and we want to be able to move together to protect the different ways of being and the different ways of knowing. Thank you.
So we've got some time if anyone has any questions or any comments that they wanted to make. Don.
Thank you for your presentation. It was last week I heard on the news that they're going to apparently fence off some caribou migration territory, and I'm a farmer, but I just don't think this makes sense. I'd just like your comments on it.
We've been a part of those discussions with the government. We actually filed suit against both the federal and provincial government for their lack of protective measures of caribou, and they sort of came back with that very sort of, okay, so we'll fence off this area here and maybe it'll work. Unfortunately, it's like a sort of step in the right direction, but it doesn't really do anything. It's almost like lip service to the public, or this appearance as though that they're doing something. But when you look at the caribou herd migration routes that have been documented by both the federal and provincial governments, fencing off a small corridor is not going to really do anything to ensure the survival of that species. Other questions?
Great presentation. Can you imagine, you've got 2 daughters right now, so can you imagine when they're 20 years older than you are right now? What do you think their aspirations for food are going to be then? In terms of trying to maybe have at least opportunities for traditional foods, but at the same time potentially embrace new foods coming in?
That's what drives me to do the work that I do, obviously. I don't want to see the caribou disappear and the bison completely disappear, and that's what our community is striving to work towards. But at the same time, we do have to welcome new food sort of avenues, and that's why our community is looking at greenhouses and community gardens building in the area, because we have the technologies to grow foods in a shorter growing season, and I think that will change the way we see food in the north eventually in a more holistic way. But we have to look at the protection of biodiversity, not just for agriculture, but for species survival. We watched a fantastic little video in the breakout session with rural versus urban, or rural and urban connections, where this farmer talked about how he stopped hearing the meadowlark on his farm. And so he changed the way he farmed so that eventually he ended up with like 80-some species of birds and different animals, and the sounds of the biodiversity became deafening. That's what we need to be striving towards, because it's respectful of different ways of being, and not just as humans, but as species on this planet. And that's what we really need to be striving towards, because if we can do that, then there will be no contesting of traditional rights versus agricultural and urban versus rural, because if we create sustainable ways of being that are respectful to everything, then, and I don't know what that is yet, I think we're working towards it, and I think we're starting to take those steps. It's just how do we take that little tiny spark and grow it into a flame? And I hope that we can get there, and I hope that my children in 20 years will still be able to eat the fish from Lake Athabasca, or be able to know what it means to prepare dried meat. but also know how to plant a garden, because I have a garden at home, and I think it's important.
Hi, thank you. The report you did on stewardship and co-management of caribou species, and that was presented, I believe, to the government.
Pardon?
The report that you did on co-management, how was that received and what's the status of it?
That's a very good question. I had some conversation about that at lunchtime today. So, we put forward this idea of co-management to both the provincial and the federal governments. And I think one of the biggest obstacles that First Nations face in Canada is the fact that we don't have traditional provincial boundaries. So Treaty 8 exists in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and the Northwest Territories, yet resources and the jurisdiction of resources exists in provincial boundaries because of things like NRTA. And so we have to sort of play like this game where we're constantly having to present these things to both the federal and the provincial governments in order to do due diligence to both systems of government. The federal government hasn't really said much yet. They never really say much. But the provincial government basically had a meeting with us, and they said, wow, these are really interesting suggestions. Co-management is very complicated, is kind of what they said to us. And that they said that they're developing their own biodiversity management plan, which will be rolling out in the next 2 years, and they hope to incorporate some of our suggestions in our stewardship plan into that. But as far as co-management goes, that they didn't think it was the right time, and that if they were going to further discussions around co-management, that they would have to have industry at the table, which I thought was very strange. Little shady, actually.